summer marks the 25th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Designed to level the playing field, the ADA prohibits discrimination and ensures equal opportunities for those living with disabilities. While the law isn't perfect, this week's first look shows the world of difference it's made since its passage.
Nowadays, wheelchair ramps, breaks in the curb, and elevators are commonplace. But Denise McMullen Powell remembers a time when they were luxuries.
When I went to Hercules, it was very difficult because there were no elevators in the buildings. I'd ask about, well, what happens when there's a fire? How do I get out of the building? And they just did oh, we'll get you out somehow or another. A little scary.
She remembers her bosses telling her it'd be cheaper to fire her than to make the necessary accommodations.
They were actually able to say things like that, and there's nothing I could do about it.
That's what life was like for Powell before the Americans with Disabilities Act. The 69-year-old contracted polio as a toddler. This was before the vaccine. She used crutches and braces for a while before having to switch over to a wheelchair full-time.
I eventually left in 1989 because it was getting too hard on me.
This is attorney Brian Hartman. He runs the Disabilities Law Program for the Community Legal Aid Society.
Prior to the ADA, there were very few state laws that required commercial establishments, stores, and vendors to not discriminate on the basis of disability. So that was one of the major changes that you've seen from 1990 until now.
The ADA was signed into law on July 26, 1990.
It was ADAPT that was climbing up the steps of the Capitol building to get them to introduce the ADA in the first place.
ADAPT is a grassroots organization that encourages activists like Powell to engage in civil disobedience in the name of disability rights.
That's why I've been arrested 20 times.
People like Denise made the way for someone like me.
Emmanuel Jenkins has only known life with the ADA.
They fought for it, and now my job is to fight to make sure it's upheld, to make sure that it keeps going, to make sure that I make way for the next generation.
Diagnosed with cerebral palsy, the 31-year-old says the ADA is not about special treatment. It's about independence.
I want to be able to live. And when I say that, I don't just mean breathe, because I'm breathing, I'm living, I'm married, I got a kid, I'm doing great. But I want to be able to live, to be able to go to work, to be able to go to school, to be able to take advantage of life, to be successful without a whole bunch of barriers.
Jenkins, who lives in Harrington with his family, is grateful to live in a state that encourages and supports opening the door wider for people with disabilities who want to work and contribute.
Employing people with disabilities makes good business sense, and it helps government improve the competitiveness of our workforce.
But as far as Delaware has come, the newest employee of the state's Developmental Disabilities Council says there's still work left to do. For example, Delaware's Department of Transportation recently inventoried all of the sidewalks the state is responsible for in each county. The report shows only 44% of the total miles it maintains meet ADA standards.
They concede that there were problems in the past, but they're trying their best to move forward and to come up with a deliberative way to fix things.
Money's an obvious issue, but Hartman says sometimes making sense out of hundreds of pages of federal law can be tough.
Whenever you have a regulation or a law, there's ambiguity, and the ADA is no different.
It should happen that if you're not in compliance with a law that's 25 years old, that there is some sort of penalty and some sort of acknowledgement that it's bad and that you have to correct it.
Other states are also guilty of non-compliance with the ADA, so Mark, Delaware is not alone.
But if it's a federal law, how are the states getting away with with not meeting the standards of ADA?
Emmanuel Jenkins from my story says a lot of it boils down to just lack of education. You know, people, companies, governments, it's not like they don't want to make these changes or they don't want to be in compliance with the law, but unless you know someone who is living with a disability, unless that issue really hits close to home, it's hard to know what kind of access or resources are needed and to what extent. For example, Jenkins is now working for the Developmental Disabilities Council in Dover. State-owned building, state-run, even that building is not 100% in compliance. The difference, though, is with the ADA, it seems like the attitude has shifted. So everyone there is saying, listen, Emmanuel, let's work with you to make this office yours and accessible. And I think that's where you see that big change from when the law was enacted.
So how are the requirements under the ADA law enforced?
Unfortunately, it usually takes a lawsuit.
So really not actively enforced at all then?
Right. There are no ADA police officers out there looking and saying, hey, you're in violation of the law.
I'm going to write you a ticket. Right.
Right. You do have to file that lawsuit. And that takes a lot of time on a private individual's part, time and effort. And so that's a discouraging factor in terms of enforcement of the ADA. But again, it is not a perfect law. Laws generally are not. But everyone in my story says they are really grateful that they actually have a law to work with over nothing at all.
All right. The 25th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act comes this summer on July 26th. Thanks, Shirley.